today's video is going to be a kind of a gift to you plant nerds out there, and those of you in the community. We've been talking off and on about our various harvests as the fall has come in, and today we pulled a yam from the garden that was 2 years old, and it took two people to carry it to the house, and then I had to break it in half in order to be able to weigh it on a scale. And I had to get the bathroom scale and stand on it because it would not fit on my produce scale. It weighed in at 85 pounds, and this is a 2-year-old yam. This is the record-setting yam that we have ever pulled in all of the history of growing yams. I have never had a yam this big. I think it's because my little daughter has faith, and she's like, we should go and see what's in that yam and let's see how big it is. I said, I don't know if I want to pull it or if I'll just let it stay there another year and maybe make some more bulbils. But I'm like, you know what? It wouldn't hurt to find out where the top of it is, because there was a whole bunch of overgrowth and sticks and stuff in that corner, and I had mounded things up over the area, and there's this big old thick vine that was climbing up this old half-dead cherry tree at the very corner of my grocery row gardens. And I said, I'll just get back to where the base of it is and we'll just kind of see. And you know how it goes when you just sort of try to see what a root looks like. And then next thing you know, you're just going to dig a little bit, and you just dig a little bit more, and then you kind of get into the thrill of the chase. And so I ended up going in and digging around and finding out that this thing kept going out. Everywhere I went down, I was finding more and more flat nodes of yam going sideways, sideways, sideways all around it. And she said, my daughter said, maybe we should record this. I said, yeah. I said, I was kind of just enjoying like hanging out in the garden and playing around, but this yam is like getting into Guinness Book of World Records territory, and people are just gonna have to see it, you know? So it's like the Moby Dick of yams. And so we started digging this thing, and I blasted the hose around it and loosened it up, and I was trying to get it without breaking it, and just kept going around and going around and going around, and we went further and further and further beneath it until finally it was sitting in this pocket of muddy water, and we just kept scraping it out the sides, and we worked it out of the hole without breaking it. But I could not pick it up completely, so I could just barely get it, and I was afraid I was going to break it or break my back trying to pull it out. So anyhow, yeah, so my son and I carried it into the house, and we weighed it 85 pounds. And I said, you know what? We've had enough questions on yams that if I did an in-depth presentation on yams, on the different varieties, the ones that'll grow up north, the ones that'll kind of grow in the middle, and the ones that grow in the tropics, and the different varieties that we've tried, and then I show you some yams for demonstrations, it will be a video that could be useful for people for a long time to come. I have a lot of faith, I guess, in yam as a survival crop, and I believe that it is woefully underutilized. I think that it has been unfairly demonized and put on invasive species lists, and it should be cultivated and used and eaten, and it should be basically your in-ground survival pantry food. You could just store it in the ground. That's your survival pantry in zones 8, 9, 10, 11, particularly the Dioscorea alata varieties. It should be your in-ground storage food that will get you through tough times. And from basically October until May, the roots are good and store in the ground with no work. You can just leave them there. You don't have to dig them. And the rest of the year, it's in active vegetative growth phase, and the root will deteriorate beneath the ground, and it will build a new root, and it will be just bigger year after year, unlike a lot of crops that you start and you have to harvest it within the year, and then you have to start it from seed again. If you don't bother getting around to harvest it, it will continue to grow back and will still be good. It's not like it's going to get woody or awful or anything else. There will be bad parts of it if it gets gigantic. The middle part tends to get woody, but it's always putting on these new side shoots and that are all really, really good to eat. Okay, so I'll show you something here. This right here, this is last year's yam. That piece. That's the part that grew last year, and it was probably a couple of pounds, and it's completely shriveled away and eaten to make the new yam. This is all the new yam. So if you have this old yam in the ground, you just leave it, it'll get digested. All the juice has been sucked out of it, and it's converted into a new and bigger yam. So every year, like this yam would get eaten the next year, and it would continue to expand. Pretty cool. Old yam, new yam. I'm going to cover some varieties. We'll start with the Dioscorea alata. It's our most significant producer out of all of the ones we grow. And we'll cover ones for people up north a little bit and a little bit later. But I have here some bulbils. Bulbils are the aerial roots. These are Dioscorea alata bulbils. These can be found wild in Florida in colonies here and there. This is Dioscorea alata. I have found multiple colonies of them over the years. I found some of them growing next to an old it had been a cracker house property where the old house had burned down and a new house had been built. And the lady was a master gardener. And I went back in her woods and was just looking around the woods. And she was like, oh, this tree over here and this tree over here. And I said, wait a minute. Right along the edge of the property, I'm seeing Dioscorea alata bulbils hanging on the vines from the trees. And I started digging and she's like, whoa, whoa, there's some back here. Oh, help yourself. So I dug up some and brought them home. They have escaped. Dioscorea alata is unfortunately on the Florida invasive species list because it does exist in the wild, but it is nowhere near the pest of its cousin, Dioscorea bulbifera, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is what the planting material. There you go. That's a Dioscorea bulbifera. Let me put that. I'm going to spotlight you here 1 second. This is the wild form of Dioscorea bulbifera. That is a very common weed in Florida, and they've released a beetle to try and eradicate it, and it has not been eradicated. I think they've stopped the beetle program, but they did reduce the populations. The vines are very vigorous. They produce hundreds of those bulbils, and they spread all over areas by dropping bulbils. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I'm going to show you. This is about a 1 year. This is a 1 year old Dioscorea alata. So if you planted this in the ground in the fall, anytime into the spring, it will awaken from dormancy and it will grow vines that will climb whatever is closest. I tried growing them by allowing them to sprawl on top of the ground like sweet potatoes, and they don't like that very much. They do not make good tuber sizes. They want to go up. They have a very natural tendency to go up and gather sunlight. And then at the end of 1 year, you get this. And they can be a little bit bigger than this, 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 4 pounds, 5 pounds. If you put them in better soil, they do better. If they get more water, they do better. But if you completely ignore them, they still tend to get to a decent size, half pound to a pound. It's maybe not much to eat in the first year, but if you leave it in the ground, in the second year, it can get up to 15, 20, 25, 30, or even in the case of my insanely large one, which was benefiting from all of the extra manure and compost and watering, etc., that the Grocery Rural Gardens got, it got more love than any wild one that I have ever dug, 85 pounds. That is a way out there outlier. You could expect a 19-pound yam. That's usually around the size that I'll get them if I plant this size. This is a really good starter yam. A little while ago, about a week ago, I posted my friend Kate. I had given her and her husband David one of these that it was about this size, and I said, "Plant this if you want to live." And I said, "Grow these things in your yard just so you survive, right?" And she planted it, and she dug it up early. She dug it up probably a month early. They've not even gone into full dormancy yet, and she's fighting with this thing to pick it up. It's probably 30 pounds or so, and it made this great, the soil was very loose, had a lot of organic matter in it, and it made this great big globe. It looked like some sort of scary planet with all these little knobs coming out of the side of it. And she's like, wow. And of course, the experience of somebody growing a plant that is just this scary productive, it's always fun to watch people see these things. Like, you can eat that? I brought a 20 something pound one to a farmer's market about 10 years ago, a little bit north of Ocala, to show the farmers and to show the other vendors. I had my little plant nursery there, and I said, I'm going to show them what our yam look like because I dug one up around this time of year and we were getting to those beautiful fall market days. I said, I'm going to bring one of these and show it to my farmer friend over there. So I was like, hey, Tim, check this out. And he's like, what is that thing? I said, it's a yam. And he's like, everybody thinks yams are sweet potatoes, but yams are not sweet potatoes. So the Dioscorea alata is our top producer, and that is the also called the greater yam. Sometimes it's called the water yam. It is There are improved varieties of it, but it's really kind of the wild, what they call down in the Caribbean, bush yam. It's the one that just kind of grows on its own and it makes a knobby, multi-lobed shape to it. That's the most common variety we have, but there are varieties that make a really nice shape. There was a type down in Grenada that they called moonshine yam, and it was also Dioscorea alata, but it made a very nice shaped tuber that just had a few lobes and they were not deeply indented. It was a very pretty shape, much easier to process and peel than the multi-lobed sorts that we have found here. But this is not in the United States yam country. The diversity of yam varieties, the availability of propagated materials is very low. And people are not familiar with it, so they're not trading it. It's not like with sweet potatoes, you can get 25 different varieties of sweet potatoes or more. If you get into beans, you can get hundreds of varieties of beans and carrots and crops that we're familiar with. There's probably 1,000 varieties of tomatoes that you can get. But with yams, well, it's like, well, that's Dioscorea alata, and you get the one kind of half wild, not bred up variety. It's rather like you'll often see with loquat trees, where you see seedling loquat trees all the time. But to get a cultivar of loquat, you've got to go to a specific nursery that appreciates them as a tree, like A Natural Farm or Scrubland Farms or a permaculture nursery, where they know that there are better varieties and they've collected better varieties and they've grafted them and propagated them. And that has been made hard for us with the Dioscorea alata in particular because of the blanket. It's an invasive species. It makes it hard for people that want to share in this exciting and amazing crop. And even 100 years ago, there were bulletins on what a good crop it could be in the Gulf region and through Florida. And I just got a PDF of it, and I'm trying to clean it up and republish it because there's a bunch of data on yams as a exciting crop that could be better than potatoes, and it's just kind of gotten overrun by the invasive species element. Oh, it's invasive. Oh, it's invasive. But if you were to say Brassica oleracea is an invasive species, you could say that because there are Brassica oleraceae that are running wild here and there, but there are cultivated Brassica oleraceae that we have in our gardens, like broccoli. It's not invasive, but it's got invasive cousins. It's got invasive It's the same species and it's invasive. So this is it's kind of a problem because we're not allowed to research and grow the way that we would want to necessarily. And the people that usually propagate and share species are a little nervous about it because, well, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't know where the lines are on, well, this is not the invasive version. This is a cultivar. This is a vegetable. This is not the same thing, you know. So it's kind of a problem. But the other form of Dioscorea alata that is actually a much higher value Dioscorea alata, at least in the market, is this one. This one right here, this is a 2-year Dioscorea alata, but this variety is known as ube. And ube is the purple variety of Dioscorea alata. It is also less vigorous than the white variety. So this at 2 years is 11 pounds, whereas I would expect a 2-year white variety to be as big as 19, 20, 30 pounds. It's not as vigorous. It doesn't make as many bulbils. It doesn't run as high or as fast. But this variety is greatly prized by Filipinos and sold in international markets as ube yam. It's made into desserts. Ben& Jerry's ice cream made an ube flavored ice cream variety. It's used in puddings and it has a brilliant, gorgeous purple interior. But if you say ube yam, people think it's the purple yam, and they think it's a completely different species. They don't recognize it as being the same as the white version, but they're just different. Let's say, you know, here's your Roma tomato and here's your beefsteak tomato. They're both tomatoes. They're both Lycopersicum, you know, same species, but they are different cultivars. And you can see the lobing on this one. This is a little better behaved. This is easier to process than some of those yams that I pulled up that have a ton of little lobes on them. These guys tend to get a whole bunch of lobes and they make a big, big, messy root. This ube is also often confused with purple sweet potatoes. And I'm going to show you something really quickly here. Purple sweet potato. If you look up articles on ube, you will almost always see, even the article that was posted recently, purple sweet potato. That's an ube. They'll say that's an ube. And sometimes they're actually used in the same recipes. I got this purple sweet potato. That's an ube, right? But it's not. We'll take a piece off of this ube here. That's ube. That's purple sweet potato. So you can see why people will get confused. It's almost the same color. It's a similar texture. They got some white sap in there or some white markings in there. Um, but if you see articles, they're commonly confused. I even saw an article once that said, yams and sweet potatoes are different. However, they're closely related. They're not closely related. They're not even like on the same planet almost when it comes to botanical varieties. This is a dicot. This is a monocot. That's one of the biggest distinctions. This is like a monocot, right? Palm trees, grasses, corn. Uh, a dicot, that's like your tomatoes and beans, right? So dicot meaning it when it sprouts, it divides in two. It's got two halves. It's got that bilateral symmetry. Whereas the monocots are the ones that are one thing comes up, right? So mono and di, they're not even like they're so far apart, but there's a lot of similarity here. There's enough similarity here that every time somebody goes and pulls a picture of ube online, almost all the time, I'm seeing this in a lot of articles, they've got a purple sweet potato. It's not an actual ube. So for the plant geeks out there, these things are not the same. These things are not even close to the same, except that they can be used in similar fashion. They're both roots. They are both purple inside. They're both starchy. This one tends to be sweeter. This one is not as sweet. But this is the real ube, and it is its own thing. But the ube and the white yam that has escaped here and there in Florida are both Dioscorea alata, and there are other varieties of Dioscorea alata too that we have not been able to get and grow in the States. The variety called Moonshine, I wish I could get it here, but I have no idea how I could get it. It's it's difficult to get things into the United States through proper channels. Some of these crops came in people's pockets with immigrants, 100 years ago and got spread around. But the way you could tell when you see the bulbils hanging on the vine, the bulbils are the aerial roots of Dioscorea alata. They look like that. They have weird, misshapen, kind of odd. There's another one. They're odd. They're not those beautiful round ones. If you have those beautiful round ones, those are probably the toxic Dioscorea bulbifera. So let's talk about Dioscorea bulbifera, because Dioscorea bulbifera is a big problem in Florida, and it's probably the reason that yams in general kind of got taken from. Could be a great possible crop to don't bring that thing into the state. We don't want to see it anymore. Kill it with fire. Dioscorea bulbifera makes a huge amount of bulbils on the vine. It's often called the air potato or air yam sometimes, but we always called them air potatoes, and we played stick ball with them when I was a kid. The neighbor that lived behind the church that I grew up in had them growing on his fence, and the son of that neighbor, his name was Jake. Jake and I would play all the time, and I would go over to his house and hang out on the break of church. There was an early service and then a half-hour break, and then they had a second service that had the sermon and that all the Sunday school and all that kind of stuff. There was a half-hour break in between, and we would play kill the man with the ball and tag and all that kind of stuff, all in our nice church clothes, and we'd run around in the yard. But we were right next to, across the fence, Jake's yard, and on that fence every year there were these air potatoes that would grow. And so later in the year down in South Florida, they still set on the vine at the same time of year that they do here. It gets to October and they're starting to make all these little bulbs on the vine. September, they're maybe just starting to form. October, and then they're big in November and December and January and February. They hang on the vine and then they fall all over the ground. And then wherever they fall, they sprout and they start new plants. But we would take them and throw them at each other. We would throw them in the air and whack them with sticks. We'd probably spread them all over the neighborhood. The problem with the wild forms of Dioscorea bulbifera is that they are almost invariably toxic. Somebody brought it in to the country and said, this could be a possible crop, but he got the wilder form of it, which has bitter toxins in it, and it has a toxin called diosgenin, among other things, and it will cause vomiting, severe stomach pain, a headache, possibly hair loss, and other things if you consume it too much. It can be used medicinally. They've used it to balance out hormones and other things, but it's not the sort of thing that you can just cook and eat. Some people have said, oh, if you boil it in changes of water and this and that and the other thing, but anything that could make you, maybe go sterile and lose your hair and vomit, it's like, I don't really care about the changes of water. I have other things I can eat. It's just probably not worth the effort. So that variety escaped, and apparently the researcher who had brought it into the country also said there's a high possibility that this could become invasive. It seems to grow really easily. And then I guess he abandoned his plot and it spread all over the state. And then a lot of people have planted it because it makes these beautiful heart-shaped vines, and they'll say, "Oh, Mabel, that was the most beautiful heart vine on your. Can I have some of those?" "Oh yeah, just take the little bulbs off it and go take it, put it up alongside your porch. It'll grow all over all that iron up there. You'll love it." And then these ladies share it, right? People brought them all over the place, and everywhere that it could grow, it's gotten planted as an ornamental. And then after a little while, they're like, man, that thing's like kudzu. It done ate my whole backyard. And they just keep dropping and they'll grow 40 or 50 feet, these vines way up into the trees. And then all of those bulbils drop like bombs when they die out in the fall. Both alata and bulbifera and a lot of your other yams have a dormancy season that runs from the end of the year. Down in the tropics, it's pretty much running through the dry season in the winter. It's they start to go to sleep in November and they're pretty much done. The vines die back in December and January and they just get crunchy and the vines basically just dry up and start blowing away and falling off of the roots. You can't even find where the roots are if you wait until February or March because the vines have dried up so much and crumpled away that you'll just go pushing around to try and figure out where it is. You're going to have to actually dig to try and figure out where was the base of that. You really kind of got to do research to find the base because they really suck all the moisture out of those vines, build the root as big as it can, go to sleep, and they sleep through the dry season and they wait for it to rain again. So they're often popping up when the May and the June rains really kick. That's when they start to jump and they'll start to put on eyes. Even if you have one sitting on your counter, it'll start to put on little buds in usually around April. You'll start to see these little growth buds appear on it, like eyes on a potato. Until then, it's just a little blank bulbil, and it just looks, there it is. It just sits there, and it doesn't do anything. It looks like a little rock. And then suddenly you'll start to get these little white bumps that'll appear at one end of it, usually, maybe one or two or three. If you leave it sitting and you don't plant it, eventually they'll actually start making vines out of it, looking for something to grab, using the moisture and the whatever is stored inside of here to build a new vine. If you put it in the ground and it's moist and warm, it'll grow a lot faster. But even if you just leave it on your counter, they'll start to put up a vine and eventually it'll dry out and die if you don't plant it. But they have a timer built into them. So these bulbifera will drop on the ground and sleep through the winter, and then in May or so, they start sprouting everywhere. Everywhere. So if you imagine you have a 60-foot vine that makes, say, 30, 40, 50, 60 bulbils on it, and then they drop all over the place, you could blanket an entire patch of woods with all of those little bulbs running all over the ground. And then the next spring, when they all start waking up, they start climbing all the trees and fighting with each other and matting and growing over the area. So this has become a problem, particularly in spaces that are about half sunny, disturbed areas where they can break in and there's not a full shade canopy. If they can climb it and cover it, they'll do it. And so they'll grow back and cover a fence every single year. Now, bulbifera being a pain in the neck like that and being toxic has a very bad reputation. So if you look up Dioscorea bulbifera and say, I heard there was an edible variety, and you want to go buy the edible variety on Etsy or something, you'll see a lot of listings that say air potato, air potato, air potato, but they're often just the wild form of it that people are basically growing as an ornamental. The edible forms of it generally have interesting shapes, like weird geometric shapes or pancake shapes or lobed shapes. I have 4 varieties of Dioscorea bulbifera, not all of which have names. This is the one that we've been growing for the last 2 years to grow seed out from. And unlike the one that Mr. Bell was showing us a minute ago, this is not round. It's got weird triangular shape to it. I had a variety that had square pieces coming out of it. It looked like some sort of a modernist nightmare piece of architecture where it had these weird lobed angles to it that were squared off. This variety tends to make these weird wrinkly edges. And this variety of bulbifera does not have the high levels of toxins in it. All you have to do is boil it until it's somewhat tender, and you could peel the skin off like paper, or you can peel it first and then boil it until it's somewhat tender, and it is slightly sweet, kind of starchy, a rather dense flesh, and at least one person reported that it could be slightly bitter sometimes. If it was really bitter, I probably wouldn't eat it. That's generally a sign you're not supposed to. But the one that I had was not bitter, and maybe growing conditions as well. Sometimes when plants are stressed, they have different flavors, but ours have been pretty sweet. Just sort of a mildly sweet and almost a little bit of caramel aftertaste after you eat it. That is pretty much a potato that grows on a vine. It doesn't make as much harvest as a Dioscorea alata. An alata that can make a 29-pound root. If you have one of these vines, it's probably going to give you something like 5 pounds of these bulbs, maybe. That would be about right. Maybe 2 to 5 pounds. But the benefit of it is you don't have to dig it. You could just grow it on a fence, and then you could pick all these in the fall and get them. So this is one variety. This is another variety, also not round. You can see it's got kind of a little bit of a weird angle to it. I got this variety from Grower Jim in Orlando. I believe it's called Hawaii. And it's shiny and pretty, and it's a more of a potato shape. It's not quite so bizarre. Also Dioscorea bulbifera, also reportedly sweet and good to eat, or at least starchy and good to eat, not bitter, I mean. And I have not tried this one yet because I only got one bulbil this last year, and I got a few of these that grew on it. And I mean, I probably got 4 or 5 pounds from a little bulbil that were bigger than the original bulbil. So that's not bad. Here is another variety. This one is a purple variety, also from Grower Jim. Now, I've read that the purple variety can sometimes give you a headache or an upset stomach. I don't know if this is true yet. I haven't eaten it. And the problem is when you're dealing with these little niche crops that are getting passed around, you don't know what it was originally bred by, where it came from. You're going to have to taste test it a little bit. If you go and you buy it in a market where you know that somebody has been eating it, it's one thing. But somebody could say, hey, I heard this was an edible type. Cool, I'd love to grow an edible type. And a guy grows a few and then he sells a few. And you don't have like a track record of, oh yeah, my ancestors have been eating these things for, you know, 500 years. Like we've got a really good track record on potatoes. We know that if you got a really green potato, you don't eat it. And we know that most, Yukon Gold potatoes are kind of buttery and russets can store well and such is good as a new potato, etc. We don't really have any of that data. And a lot of the societies I've heard that grow these, they may not even be literate or the type of people that record what they have. You may have an oral tradition that goes along with this crop that we just don't know anything about. And so we've got this crop, somebody brought it in, and now we're going to have to test it and taste it. So far I've tasted this one, I have not tasted this one, and I have not tried these guys. So what we do is we're going to peel it and cook a portion of it and then eat it and see if we live. And that's how we do science. Here's another one. This is also from Grower Jim, and you can see, look how different it is, right? This one, to me, this one is a lot rougher. Was not super productive, but I got probably about 3 pounds off of it. It grew next to these, and you could see there's a real difference. This is more russeted, and this one is just that really shiny, smooth. It feels really good, almost feels like leather. This one is very rough. It feels like a russet potato. And you could see there's a bit of a color difference too. Some of these were almost white, and you could see some of them have some green chlorophyll shining through. They obviously were photosynthesizing a little bit. But these are all bulbifera varieties. And there are varieties of bulbifera that are like a large flat pancake with little nubs on it. I saw a video recently, and I'm trying to get in touch. I wrote the YouTube channel, tiny little permaculture video channel where they had a variety in Hawaii, and the bulbil was that big. I mean, it looked like it was probably 4 pounds, 3 pounds maybe from one bulbil that they pulled off. That is pretty epic. I would love to find out more about it. So I wrote them. I was like, whoever you are, please write me back. Um, we'll find out. Now, this size here, we get a lot that are that big, and then you get a lot of them that didn't really get that big. They're only about that big on the vine. So for everyone that's about that big, you might get 4 or 5 that are maybe that big, and then you might get one that's I've got one that's about almost twice as big as this one. These are, in my experience, not invasive like the wild ones. They are a vigorous vine. They do make bulbils, but they're nothing like the level of sheer insanity that those toxic round ones are. They are a little better behaved. Again, it's kind of like your bred up Brassica oleracea compared to your wild form that's just a weedy form that's really scrappy, high survival, but maybe having the sweet compounds being non-toxic, etc., has weakened the genetics of it. It's made it a domesticated version, rather like, putting your Chihuahua out in the wild compared to putting a wolf out in the wild. You could say, well, they're both dogs, I guess, but this one is much better behaved. It's not super wild and crazy. It's succulent, it's sweet. Maybe it doesn't reproduce as well. Maybe it's a little bit more like a coop chicken compared to a wild jungle fowl. So good crop, not invasive in our gardens, uh, but it is a little difficult because I know in Florida, with bulbifera having such a very bad name, it's like telling somebody that, well, our kudzu's not like that. And they, if anybody's had a bad experience with bamboo, for example, and you tell them how much you love bamboo, they lose their minds. Bamboo punched holes through my patio. Bamboo stabbed my cat to death growing in the night. Bamboo punched holes through this and that, the other thing, and it spread. It picked up my Pontiac in the night and lifted it over the house, right? It's like they've experienced what running bamboo is like, and then you try to tell them that your golden goddess bamboo is not the same thing and that it's really great for building flutes, and they're like, yeah, you get that thing near my house, I'm calling the police on you. So, if somebody sees you planting bamboo in the yard and they know that's the experience that people are going to have with bulbifera. You start, go down to the extension office and ask them how much they love bulbifera. Tell them, I've been collecting varieties of bulbifera. Sorry, we're going to have to ask you to leave the free state of Florida. It's over. So that's what we got for bulbifera. And I want to move on and cover Dioscorea pentaphylla. Dioscorea pentaphylla is the 5-leaf yam. We've grown this one for 2 years. I had one of them down in the Caribbean, but we didn't really harvest it or utilize it very much. We had a lot of varieties of Dioscorea alata, and then we had Name yam, which is Dioscorea rotundata, or Cayennensis SPP rotundata. As I was looking back at that Wikipedia, I'm like, no wonder I can't keep them straight, because they're like, rotundata may be a subspecies of Cayennensis. And then you go to rotundata and it's like Cayennensis may be a subspecies of rotundata. And it's like rotundata may be a synonym of Cayennensis. Okay, whatever. They're those ones that are like that that you get at Publix. There's Jamaica yellow yam and there's Name, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Dioscorea pentaphylla is easy. It's the 5-leaf yam. It's got a leaf that is divided. Sometimes there's 4, sometimes there's 5, but it's a pretty leaf, and it looks more like a Virginia creeper leaf than it does a regular yam leaf. It's pretty. It's attractive. It grows quickly. It makes an edible tuber as well. And I grew it to test and see how the edible tuber was because nursery owner Derek Clausen, who I've been trying to get to join our group because he's got a lot of interesting plants and some good ideas, but he's busy. Uh, Derek sent me some a few years ago, sent me some bulbils and I planted them. So 2 years ago, I started planting, I started growing them just to see how they would do. And they grew a nice, vigorous pair of vines, but I had them planted at the end of my Dioscorea alata, and I thought that I lost them because I yanked down the trellises. I dug the entire row of alata, and then later that winter, I was like, I wonder what happened to those pentaphylla that were at the end. Did I dig those roots, and did they look exactly like the Dioscorea alata? I know that I had them at the end of the row, and I'm like, wouldn't it be terrible if I ate those roots and I didn't even know that, maybe they look exactly the same. So I thought maybe I'd lost them. And I know that early in the season they were growing, but they were not as vigorous as the alata, and the alata just covered the entire area. So at the end of the season, I had this massive mess of vines that were freezing down on top, and I just cut the whole thing off and yanked all the trellises up and dug. So when spring came along this year, I thought I had lost them, and it came to May, and then sometime in May, a couple of shoots came up in that bed, which now had no trellis at all, and the first couple of leaves opened up, and they had five, and I was like, they were all the way down just past the end of the alata, and I didn't lose them. So I found out my Dioscorea pentaphylla, though they may get overrun by alata, they're not as vigorous. I also discovered that they were cold hardy because I left them in the ground. I had left the roots in the ground. They were cold hardy enough to survive a 17-degree night, at least 48 hours below freezing at one point, and they lived. So in the ground, they are hardy to zone 8B, lower Alabama, so they should do all of Florida, no problem, and probably lower Georgia and maybe up into 8A, who knows. But if you're further north, it's worth testing because you maybe push it one zone further. So I grew it and I looked it up. I have a book on yams. It's called Yams, Botany, Production, and Uses. And it is a scientific manual tracking the economics of yams, the harvest of yams around the world, varieties of yams. There's a lot of just heavy number data and notes on storage and other things. And it's one of those books that costs, like $120 because they use it at textbooks, for people that are like, should we eat yams or should we make a mealworm breeding facility? It's sort of like those big international, they're published by CABI, CABI, but they have a whole series, Botany, Production, and Uses, and there's pictures and there's notations on probably 100 species or more of yams, which I found fascinating. I read it through all the way from beginning to end. I'm like, I didn't know Ghana produced that many yams. That's cool. Um, my wife's like, I'm like, can I read this out loud to you? You know. Anyhow, I looked it up and it says, okay, tubers are edible and it's a good crop. So it's like, okay, so I'll dig the tuber and see what it looks like. So I dug one of the two tubers, and I'd say it was about 15-pound tuber after 2 years. That is an extremely weird root. It's weirder looking than alata is. Dioscorea pentaphylla. Write that down, kids. That is a weird yam. So not as big as the alata, a little bit bigger than the ube that we had planted, but they're very tender. They have a lot of little lobes on the tuber and they broke easily. When I moved it to the ground, I set it on top of a paver to wash it off. It bruised and crushed some of the bottom of the root. So it bruises and crushes very easily. It's not as tough as alata. And so it may be a very tender, dainty yam to eat. I don't know. We haven't eaten it yet. It's sitting on our porch right now. But I decided to look it up online and see if anybody had posted any further information on it. There's almost no data. So I said, well, I'll try YouTube and see if there's any permaculture people growing them. And I found a video where a fellow was growing them and he said that it had become his favorite crop, but he didn't bother digging the main tuber. Instead, like the Dioscorea bulbifera, he's eating the bulbils.
The main thing I like for the pentaphylla is not the underground root, even though it does taste good, a little watery, but much like a waxy potato, are these right here, the aerial bulbils, tubers on them. These are really good tasting, depending on how you cook them. They get nice and nutty or a nice moist potato kind of flavor.
But that is Dioscorea pentaphylla. Here's one that's a little less even. Dioscorea pentaphylla, got these from Derek Clausen. He is about 3 hours away from me, further into the state, further along the Panhandle. I think he's closer to Tallahassee area. These uh, are pretty abundantly produced on the second year. I've got a basket full of these from those two yams that were in the ground. They were just producing in just bunches all over. And they're all about that size. And so what this man was saying on YouTube was that they eat these things all the time. They taste very good. They kind of have a nutty, almost a roasted peanut flavor, that they roasted them or boiled them. That's a possibility. And again, when you're not finding any data, there's no data on that in Yams botany production and uses. It only talks about the tuber. And I can't find any other useful data on the species just by searching it online. It's again, we're kind of dealing with crops that are underutilized and under researched. So we're going to have to just try and cook some of these and eat them, and then we will start the process of researching them and maybe sharing data on them in English. We'll start our own thing. So I left one yam in the ground. I dug the other one. We'll eat a portion of that tuber and kind of do a taste test on it. But I'm tempted to just rebury it in the food forest and let it continue to make bulbils. And then I'll plant a bunch of bulbils. And then I'll have so many seed yams that it doesn't matter if we eat them. Part of the problem is when it's so hard to get species like this purple variety of Dioscorea bulbifera, I don't want to eat it when I only have 5 of these. I want to plant them all and then grow it until I have a ridiculous amount of them. And then I can just go ahead and eat any ones I want to without thinking I'm going to lose the seed line and maybe never see it again. Because I did have a bulbifera that was absolutely beautiful. It had a pale gray white angular form to it that I had mentioned earlier, and it's lost. I cannot find that variety again. I don't even know if it exists in the state of Florida, but I had given some to Sam at Scrubland Farms. They got overrun at his place and he lost it. And I had to leave my property when I went overseas and I couldn't bring plant material with me. So, oh well. This is the Chinese yam, Dioscorea polystachya. They do get a little bit bigger than this sometimes. I've had them maybe about the size of the end of my thumb. Most of them tend to be about that size, though. They're pretty small. Some of them are a little bit more elliptical. Some of them are rounder. But I'll see if I can hold this so you can see it. They're not very big, but they make a massive amount of these tubers. This is an invasive species further north and can be very annoying because, again, it's got the propensity to make a whole ton of little bulbils that then drop off of the vines and spread everywhere. And if you're not eating it and you don't know what it is, it just becomes a nuisance. This can be a super annoying one like bulbifera, except these bulbils are edible off the vine, and they're actually quite good. They are edible raw or cooked, which for yams, most yams have a certain amount of oxalates in them, and they are not good to eat right off of the vine. To dig a tuber and just eat it would make your mouth itch and sting. My wife wears gloves when she works with yams when she's peeling them because it makes her skin itch on her hands. It doesn't bother my hands, but my hands are rougher than hers. If I get it on the inside here, I could feel it. I can get the itch. I'm like, oh, that doesn't feel good. And it's those little oxalate crystals. When you cook it, it's fine. It doesn't bother you. But the Chinese yam, Dioscorea polystachya, sometimes called Dioscorea batatas, it's got a bunch of synonyms. Sometimes they call it Chinese yam, sometimes they call it Japanese yam, sometimes they call it mountain yam. There seem to be different cultivars, there seem to be different um, names, but it's pretty much little itty bitty bulbils all over, small, pretty leaves with a little bit of red in them, and it is cold hardy to zone 5. So it will grow in North Texas, it will grow in Tennessee, it will grow in Massachusetts. It is a exceedingly cold hardy yam, and so it extends your yam growing potential way up north. The tuber itself is edible raw or cooked, and the bulbils are edible raw or cooked. The bulbils are actually like little tater tots. You can cook them, you can just fry them in oil on the stove and salt them, and they are delicious. Just skin and all. Just sizzle them on a plate and eat them. The first year, they will make a little root, and they don't give you very many bulbils. You get a few handfuls of bulbils. The second year, the root has gotten bigger. It tends to be a very long, snaky root that digs straight down, and it will make hundreds of these things. You could see in the video where my daughter is harvesting bulbils. She just shakes the trellis over a sheet, and it's like, and it's just a rain of these things. So you don't actually ever have to dig the root. If you want the benefit of having a yam that you could just cook like a little bitty tater tot, Eric Tonesmeyer calls them yam berries. And I got them to test in North Florida because I read his book, Paradise Lot, where they took this terrible urban concrete and junk filled duplex. He and a plant nerd friend split the price of the rent, and they each had half of this duplex, and they filled the entire yard full of plants as basically an urban permaculture demonstration of what you could do even in a so-so neighborhood with garbage in the soil and bad conditions. They made this beautiful lot of edible food, even though it wasn't the tropics, and he loves his tropical crops. And they figured it out. And this was one of the ones they grew, and they called it the yamberry because they're like little berries off of the vine. I would like to rename it the tater tot plant because I think that tater tot plant is probably more marketable than yam berries. Like yam berries, I don't know. Tater tots on a plant, that's cool. I think people will go for that. You can grow it with your macaroni and cheese plant, your tater tot plant, and you get some sort of fluorescent green vegetable to go with it, and you're all set. You just kind of pack them all into a TV dinner tray, and we can microwave it. That is what the masses need. And if RFK Jr. is watching this, I'm just kidding. I don't think you should have TV dinners ever. So don't come after me. Tater tot plant, sustainably harvested, no seed oils, tater tot plant. Uh, it makes a great big weird root though, and the biggest problem with harvesting the root, I've heard that the root is very good to eat. The big problem with the roots is just that they break so easily and they tend to go straight down. So every time I try to dig them, even in sand, I'll get about that deep and I'll get about that much root, and they tend to start real skinny and then they start to get bigger and then they just keep going, but just the slightest movement and they snap off. And then you're trying to dig down and you put your machete down in the ground or a shovel and you pull it, and the root is tender, so the root will just go squish, and you get all this like bits of crushed, broken root with dirt in it because it is a tender root. So, for those of you that are engineering minded, there's probably a way where you could bank up some soil and go high, maybe have a couple of tall boards or maybe some galvanized metal or something like that and do a bed that's maybe a foot wide and plant them in it and maybe go up 3 feet because the root literally is three, could be 4 feet, and it'll just keep going down. There's got to be a way to let it grow in there because when it is at ground level and it goes down, and if I'm having trouble in sand, for those of you guys that have clay or even somewhat sticky soil, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be absolutely obnoxious to try and get out of the ground. So I have heard that they grow them in banks of soil where they can break the side of the bank out and pull it out. I also grew them in a giant pot. I had probably a 40-gallon pot that I filled full of compost and potting soil and sticks and everything, to try and stretch the potting soil as far as possible, rotten wood chips. And I planted a couple of them in it at either side and let them climb my fence. So I'm gonna dump this whole pot out just for the heck of it, and we'll see if there's any yams. Just for fun. I think it's cold enough today that the fire ants are mostly asleep, which is helpful. They've been terrible. Welcome to Florida. There are roots in there. And there's also a lot of fire ants. Look at them in the bottom. Those are some weird yam roots. They're supposed to be real slick and slimy. It looks like what they did was they all moved down to the bottom. And I'm sure having the fire ants in here is probably not all that good for them. Weird. Yeah, I've never... we grow these things for the bulbils because the bulbils are really cool. Look at that. Weird. I can't even stick my hand in here. I still, even right now, I don't trust myself to be faster than the fire ants. Oh! Throw fire ants all over my camera woman. Sorry, sweetheart. Do you want to reach in there and grab the... I don't want to touch it.
After you.
I'm thinking that's probably where they went. They went to the bottom, and I see here the yams were working their way into the ground, actually, beneath the pot. There's a piece that broke off. So it kind of looked like those weird kukuza squash where it went down and it did a weird swoop like a question mark. And then I actually got the roots, but I didn't eat them for some reason. I think I harvested them and then I left them somewhere or something, because I was disorganized. It was one of those late fall, we're going to go dig everything out of the garden. Let's just kick that pot over and see what's in it. And so I totally blew it. So I still don't know what they taste like, except I've eaten the bulbils quite a few times. So these guys, I know what they taste like. I tend to just ignore the roots and let them grow in my garden and just harvest lots and lots of these. And my daughter Daisy has these in her seed store. She has been selling out our stock of them for this year because I've really, now that I have a few established plants, I can get bowls of those little bulbils. And I've thought it might even be worth making a long set of trellises and just growing the bulbils on there and shaking the entirety of it out and maybe harvesting 10 or 20 gallons of them, and they keep. They don't dry out very fast. They've got kind of a papery coating on them. They keep for quite a while. So why not just use them like a little bitty potato, and fry them up? So if you're further north, you can grow those. Just the difficulty is the shape of the root, how vigorously it wants to drill deep into the ground. So that is the Chinese yam, but just know that it is an invasive. There may be improved varieties of it. I've heard the varieties that have larger bulbils, uh, you know, that might even be better for cooking. There may be varieties that have better roots too. I don't know. We're happy with the ones that we have, but as as limited as it is, I thought loquats were a great tree with good fruit until I tasted the improved varieties of loquat, and the fruit was like this big, and it had a tiny pit on the inside, and it was much more like a big plum. I thought it was good before, but when there's an improved variety of something, there may be a much better version of it that we just haven't experienced yet. But if you're in zones 9, 8, 7, 6, and 5, that is the yam for you. I think Dioscorea alata can be pushed into zone 8, probably into 8A. Somebody sent me pictures of ube that were from they had grown them in the Nashville area, and they had managed to get them up to a couple of pounds. So ube alata, they grew that in zone 7. So it is possible. But as you get further south, obviously longer, warmer season, they are tropical, so you're just probably going to have a little more luck with it, and it will be a better survival crop for you rather than a novelty crop. I don't think you're going to get a survival level Dioscorea alata harvest out of zone 7, but I don't know. Smart people tend to jump into our gardening community and figure things out that always surprise me. So if I were up there, I would definitely try it. The next one I want to talk about is Name, and unfortunately, I don't have any Name yam with me. That's the one that's kind of gets confused. Dioscorea cayennensis rotundata, Dioscorea rotundata, whatever. It is a nice yam. It's also called Lisbon yam. I couldn't figure out what they were saying down on the island. One of the farmers said, "That's Lisbon, Lisbon." I'm like, Lisbon, Lacebon, Lisbon yam. That's a Lisbon. I'm like, Lisbon. I could not figure out what it was until somebody who also was a native but took pity on me said, he means Lisbon, like the city. Lisbon. Okay, Lisbon. Lisbon yam. It's also possible that that's a variety of Dioscorea alata that has been bred up into a nice shape. I noticed that the Dioscorea rotundata names that I planted gave me leaves like an alata. But when I planted the Jamaica yellow yam, the leaves looked a little bit more like a smilax plant. The yellow yam is supposed to be Dioscorea cayennensis, but it had thorns on the vine, and it has smaller leaves, and they had a little more of a flat shape to them that kind of rounds out at the end like that. They didn't have the full-on arrowhead look that the Dioscorea alata has. So the Name that I grew from Publix had no thorns. But when I grew a Jamaica yellow yam that I got from a international market, it does have thorns. It's thorny. It's kind of rough to pull off to pull the vines, and it was not. They did not get particularly big. They got about maybe 3/4 of a pound in the first year. Maybe I needed wider spacing. Maybe I needed to feed them better. But I'm probably going to just take those and replant them. I talked to a Catholic priest who is from Kerala, India, and I asked him about the yellow yams. I asked him if he was familiar with them, and he knew them. And he said, David, you just plant them back. Just plant them back and let them get big. So apparently, in our area, Zone 8B, they could be planted back and should live, or you could just leave them in the ground for the second year, like we do with the ube and like we do with the alata. But when I have done that with the true Name yam from Publix, they rotted in the ground and none of them came back the next year. The biggest I have managed to get the Name yams is not up to Publix big. It's about that big, maybe 3/4 pound. I maybe got a 1 pound or a 2 pound when I was in North Florida and I had really good rich soil. About that big. That's big enough to eat. That's big enough to be worth it. but I have seen them that big. And I thought, well, like the other yams, if I just leave it in the ground, it looks like an alata. It looks very similar. Maybe it'll just grow back the next year, but they rotted for me in this area. That may be because we get 62 inches or so of rain. It may be because we got rain in the winter. I had no problem overwintering moringa in North Florida when the rain patterns were pretty much mostly summer rain and then it was a pretty dry winter. But it has been wet winters where I have been north of Pensacola, Bruton area. The the wet is hard on those tropical plants because they can't grow below a certain temperature, and first they're cold, so they can't grow, so their metabolism gets almost shut down, and then they get sopping wet weather and they simply rot. They just succumb to problems. I've had that happen with cassava and with moringa and with the Name yam. So I don't know if the Name yam, maybe in the center of Florida, it would overwinter, maybe in South Texas, Southern California, it might be just fine. But the rainfall, the combination of the rainfall and then temperatures below freezing off and on, I think it was just too much for them and they rotted. So I tried to bring some in this last year because I thought, well, I'll just bring them in, put them in a basket with some hay, and overwinter them like I do with my alata. I will take, an alata like this, and I'll dig it up. It doesn't have any rotten spots on it or anything. I'll lay it in some hay or straw in a pot, put a little more hay or straw on top of it so it's just sitting down there in the dark, maybe very slightly moist because there's a little bit of moisture in there. I figure it's kind of giving it a little blanket. I'll put them in a big old pot or in like a Walmart storage bin, cover the top with hay, and I put a note on top that says Dioscorea alata or purple Dioscorea alata or um, whatever other yams I'm saving. And then I'll just put them in our hallway just inside of where the gardens are because our outdoor porch will freeze sometimes, and I lost some of my yams last year. They just completely froze through and rotted on the porch. It got below 32 and that was too much for them. When they're in the ground, they're not going to get that cold, but when they were out of the ground, it was too much. So I said, well, I'll just bring them into the house. They're not going to freeze to death in the house. And they kept just fine, and they started sprouting out of the tops in spring, right on schedule. There were sprouts coming out of the straw in the hallway. I was like, oh boy, I waited too long. I got to get those suckers in the ground. So I went out and planted them in the ground. So the Name yams, I put them away and they dried up and they rotted. They both had like dry spots on the top and then the middle of it just turned to mushy pith. So I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I might be missing nutrients. I might just be too far north. It may be that this is really a solid zone 10, 11, and it may not be suitable for storage here. Maybe I didn't handle them well enough or something, but I'm used to Dioscorea alata, which is just about bulletproof. And whatever the name is, whether it's Cayennensis SPP subspecies rotundata, or if maybe it's a touchier variety of alata because it looks a lot like alata. And then when you see all these different yams, is it yellow yam? Is it Guinea yam? Is it Lisbon yam? Is it Name yam? Some of these things are a little bit difficult when we don't have the Latin names and we're just kind of going on hearsay and trying to figure out what they are from blogs or, grabbing a random root at Publix and planting it in the ground because we're those kind of people. And so multiple years, I grew them in North Florida and we were able to eat them. But and I do think they came back from the ground there, but they have not done it for me here in 8B. So I was in 9A there and it was a dry winter, and those seem to be the difference. I'm not going to give up on them, but the Name that I dug this year was only about that big, the piece that I had started and planted in the ground. I planted a couple of them, and a couple of them disappeared, and one of them was only about that big. And when I'm looking at that compared to this, which I planted a piece, I probably planted a piece smaller than that, and then I got that, and then the next season I get an 85-pound one, Even if I'm getting a 20-pound one the next year and it's just growing on its own without me thinking about it, the alata has been the one that I've come to count on. And now that I've realized that these bulbifera varieties can do pretty well here and they make a decent amount on the vine and they taste good and they haven't poisoned me yet, I am kind of sticking to the Dioscorea alata and the bulbifera, and then our experiments are in progress with the pentaphylla, and we're going to try roasting some of these bulbils and see if what we found on YouTube is correct. I trust some random guy growing them on YouTube more than I trust an article on healthfacts.nutrition.ca or whatever with all the beautiful graphic design or everything, and you kind of go, I don't know if they know what they're talking about. So I will trust random guys on YouTube that I can see that they have them growing in their garden and they have no reason to lie to me and they're not selling me something. That is the overview on what I have of yams and in general. So before I go, I want to cover propagation. First of all, there are two ways to propagate yams that are considered like commercially viable, meaning uh, that it makes sense to do. You can start some of them from cuttings. I have done it and I've seen micro propagation of cuttings. If you say you had one variety of alata and you really liked it and you could get a bunch of cuttings off it, you can root them by taking pieces of stem cutting and putting them under mist sometimes, or putting them in a humidity chamber in the greenhouse and keeping them watered. Cut off most of the leaf, get a little bit of vine, make sure a node is in the ground, put a little bit of rooting hormone on them. They may make a tiny little tuber at the end of the year, and then next year you'll probably get something worth harvesting, but it's a slower producer that way. It's better to start with existing root pieces. So this existing root piece right here, the top part of it where the old vine was, this is called the head of the yam. Down in the Caribbean, they called this the head and this the food. So the head of the yam is used to grow more yams. It's usually pretty woody up here. If you cut this piece off, now they did this around Christmas. People that didn't have gardens, didn't have much um, money, they didn't want to go buy yams. They would go up into the mountains and look for where the yam vines were coming down to the ground. They would hunt for these in the wild and they would dig them out with a machete. They would cut the head off. They would toss the head back in the hole and mound the dirt back over it, and they would take the food and they would eat it. That way, the next year, somebody could dig up another yam, maybe them, maybe somebody else, but they would toss the head, this top part, back into the hole, and it would sleep through the dormant season and it would sprout again in May. So that if you have a yam like this part sprouts the fastest. However, all of the yam is capable of growing more yam. So you could take this thing right here and cut that here, and then cut that piece in half, and then cut another one here and cut another one here. You could probably get 6 good pieces out of this. So long as you have a good piece of skin, that's where the growing eyes are. Dust. Now you'll see the commercial people dust them with fungicides. We just dust them with wood ashes. We dust the cut surfaces with wood ashes, or let it sit out for a day or so to dry up a little bit. So you're not putting fresh cut. Just set it in the shade, let the cut surfaces dry out a little bit, and then replant it in the ground. You can do that and get about 6 from that. Or if you get the aerial bulbils, you could even cut this one in half and get 2 out of it if you wanted to. But that will sprout. So you could plant these guys, or you could cut this into a bunch of pieces and plant them, but you're gonna want to do that in the spring. These guys you could plant in the fall, you could plant in the winter, just put it beneath an inch or two beneath the ground. Just make sure it's not gonna freeze. Often they just lay on top of the ground in the tropics and then they start rooting into the ground later. Leaves will fall on top of them and they'll grow out of that and they'll start making a root down. But you could plant these in the spring, just store this thing, or leave it in the ground and then dig it up right before you want to do it and then cut it into pieces, dust it with ashes or let it dry a little bit. plant them wherever you want to plant them. Give them about 3 feet apart, maybe 4 foot apart in rows so they've got some room to grow, and give them something really good to climb on. You could get an 8 foot stick and nail 2 feet of it into the ground and let them grow on a pole like that. That's the way it was often done down in Grenada. Or you could make a wire system. A friend of mine had some hops trellises that were like 20 feet. He had this high tension wire like 20 feet up that he ran the lines down to. Not an electric high tension wire, but it was like a big steel wire that he put across. And he grew them, and they grew all the way up to 20 feet. If you have a tree that you don't love or don't care about, or like I've got some crepe myrtles, I planted these around the bases of these big old crepe myrtles and let them grow through. They'll grow happily on that. I grew a 20 something pound yam at the base of a dogwood tree. I stuck one of these in the ground and I ignored it for 2 years and then I dug it. It did nothing. I just went out there and dug it up 2 years later. So you could do that with your pieces. If you want to production run it, I think if you've got hard soil, mound it up a little bit. We dug it down. We threw a bunch of cow pies in the trenches underneath our ubes, and then we mounded up soil about 18 inches tall and beds that were about 4 to 5 feet apart. We planted them about 2.5 feet apart. We'll probably thin every other one out this first year and then let the remaining ones get really massive in the second year. And then we'll use the first year ones. We'll probably sell some of them and divide some of them up to plant more. Bulbils are really easy, but not all species make bulbils. The Name yams do not. The Jamaican yellow yam does not seem to make bulbils. The ube makes bulbils, but not a lot of bulbils. So if you don't have bulbils and you get a root, you can cut the root up and use it. And I've got videos on that. Now, if you have the aerial bulbils from something like a Dioscorea bulbifera where it's pretty big, I did an experiment this spring and I cut them into multiple pieces. The multiple pieces all sprouted. So if you were able to get one bulbil, you could cut it into half and plant two. So like I spent, I think $20 for two of these that were smaller from a seller when I started. It was this variety, and they were about half that size. It was like two bulbils, $20. Rare, edible, they're rare. So they have high value. Uh, and I planted them whole because I didn't want to lose them. But then the second year, I had like 30 or 40 bulbils from those two. And I said, yeah, I'm going to chop some in pieces and see. And sure enough, they grew. And I also noticed sometimes they make in the spring, if I leave this thing on my desk, which I can do, I just leave them laying around, they'll start to make vines and grow just like the Dioscorea alata. Sometimes it'll make one bud over here and one bud over here, like a potato with multiple eyes. Boom, I cut it in half. Now I know both of those sides are going to grow, but they would probably grow anyways. These things are almost indestructible. So if you have those, you can do that. Just cut the root into pieces and dust it and let it go. That's my recommendations on propagation. The Oriental markets, Asian markets, particularly Caribbean or African markets are where you're going to find the really interesting ones. There's a variety called Yampi, Dioscorea trifida. I think it's also called kush yam. The Dioscorea trifida, I got some roots from last season and they rotted in my greenhouse, but somebody told me that there's a great big patch of them that keeps coming back year after year somewhere near us, but I don't know where it is. But somebody has them in their garden and they grow them every year and they just keep coming back from the ground. So apparently you can grow Dioscorea trifida here as well, and there's probably a lot of other varieties, and it's totally worth exploring because this this, to my mind, is an excellent replacement for the potato. It is a not particularly recognizable crop. So if things got weird and bad and all that scary stuff, you would have a mostly unrecognizable source of calories that you don't have to dig out of the ground, that you don't have to fertilize even, that you can just let grow in half wild spaces and bugs don't seem to bother them. So there you go. It defends itself pretty well with the oxalates, and I have had consistent results long enough with enough yield to just say, this is something I'm never going to be without. And you just use them like you would use regular potatoes. And there's enough different varieties to experiment with that it is, and I think it's endlessly interesting. Just collecting Dioscorea bulbifera edible types, you could do that for your entire lifetime. And we're up to, I think, 6 or 7 varieties, or maybe 6 or 7 species of yams, and then multiple varieties inside those species. And I hope to keep expanding and experimenting with it, and hopefully ending up writing a book on yams as a crop, because there's just not enough data for this incredibly useful set of plants. This genus is so underutilized in the United States. Dioscorea needs to come back. So when people say yam, they're talking about this, and they're not talking about sweet potatoes.